All right, welcome everyone to tonight's meeting of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter of SABR. I'm Bruce McClure, the chapter chair, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner-Waterman chapter of SABR in Vermont, Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. Now, before we get started, I want to start in the usual way when she's here, and I'm going to go over to Joanne Hulbert, who has a poem for us tonight. Joanne, how are you?
Here's the story. Okay, the title is There's Hope for Everybody. All right, New York, April 27. This is 1915, a little out of the time zone, but it's okay. It's going to work. Okay. There's hope for everybody. Members of the newly organized baseball clubs in Sing Sing prison has fallen heir to a lot of old uniforms of the Yankees, which they will wear in their games this summer. Baseball is now one of the means adopted by Thomas Mott Osborne, warden of Sing Sing, to improve the physical condition of the prisoners. One of the players wrote to the owners of the Yankees asking for the old uniforms. Complete outfits for 28 players, from caps to shoes, were furnished. Here's the little verse that goes with it. In 28-hole baseball suits that once were worn by Yanks, now clothe the hulks of murderers and gents who broke up banks. This is all courtesy of Ring Lardner.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Joanne. I appreciate you. Let's flip over to Jeff Cohen, who's going to tell us about what's going on with this podcast. Jeff, what's going on with Baseball and Barbecue, man?
Thank you, Bruce. Yes, we have on this week, we had the great Jane Levy. I pronounced her name. Jane Levy, she was absolutely fantastic, as she was on with this group last week. And yeah, so she's on this week's Baseball and BBQ on all your podcast apps.
If you weren't here last week for our conversation with Jane Levy, Jeff corrected me on the pronunciation of her name. So I got him. Yes, that's fantastic. All right, let's get on with our feature presentation. Team color: Cardinal red, pirate yellow, Dodger blue. Identifiable, distinctive, and as familiar as the game itself. Today, every team has their own specified color palette and brand identity. But what about way back when, before 1900? We all know of the original Cincinnati Red Stockings, possibly the best example of sports branding ever. But were there other teams in the 19th century as connected to a specific color as Cincinnati? In fact, did the concept of team color even exist during this era? The answer is somewhat surprising. This exploration, first presented at the Fred in April, will examine the colors of 19th century baseball, a time that today seems only sepia-toned. SABR member Craig Brown is the author of Threads of Our Game, an online database chronicling the uniforms of 19th century baseball. Threads covers the majors, minors, pioneer era, collegiate, African American, and barnstorming teams, and utilizes the research documentation submitted by the SABR community. Craig is the program chair of the SABR Magnolia chapter in Atlanta, and he is here tonight to share his presentation, Team Color Before 1900. Which teams had one? Which teams didn't? Craig Brown, welcome to Northern New England, my friend. How are you?
Good, Bruce. Thank you. Thanks for the welcome.
It's all yours. I'm stepping aside.
Okay, well, this was a presentation that Bruce mentioned I gave in Cooperstown in April. So it's a little 19th century focused. If that's not really your area of expertise, just bear with me. Hopefully it makes sense. Let me find my notes. So yes, the topic is team color before 1900. Which teams had one, a team color, and which teams didn't? Okay, so team color today, it's a part of baseball, as we know, and it's also a part of all sport. More than anything, color represents our team, my team and your team. And along with the championship seasons and the famous players, color is at the core of a club's brand identity. You can see 4 examples here. This on the top left is Dodger blue. Over on the right is the A's gold and green. Bottom left is the Pirates yellow and black, and on the bottom right is Orioles orange. And these are all images of and examples of what I call the television era phenomenon, which are fans wearing the color of their team at a game and in seemingly greater numbers every year since the mid-1970s. And team colors, each professional team has a specific team color and brand identity. And these include some unique designated colors that each team owns. So for example, the green color that Seattle has been named Griffey Green. The orange color that the Astros have has been named Biggio Orange. And the Toronto blue color has been named Sky Dome Blue. So how important is team color? So if we were to swap out the Yankees midnight blue color and replace it with the Astros Biggio Orange, this is how it would look. And even with the Yankee logo still in place, this doesn't really feel like the Yankees. In fact, at first glance, it might not even look like Aaron Judge. So I think this demonstrates the importance of team color and the important role that it has in the team's identity. So what about the 19th century? What about the era of Cap Anson and King Kelly and Albert Spalding, of Ewing and Clarkson and Keeler? In this presentation, we'll make a quick exploration of team color before 1900, and we'll try to answer this question. Did the concept of team color exist in the 19th century? As Bruce mentioned, and some of you may know, I am the author of the Threads of Our Game project. So the goal of Threads is to document the uniforms of the 19th century. And it ranges from the time period of the first known uniform, which is the 1849 Knickerbocker uniform, which included a straw hat and long pants. And it goes all the way up to 1900, and that's the 1900 Brooklyn uniform. They were the champions of the National League in 1900. And one of the things that Threads allows us to do is to look at the 19th century game, which today exists only as sepia tone. So it allows us to bring the color back to the old game. And it also allows us to take a 30,000-foot view of the visual history of the game, making it easier to spot trends and trendsetters. And the idea for this presentation came about when I was working on the renderings for the Pittsburgh club. And here you can see the team's color choices throughout the late 1880s and 1890s. And when I talk about color choices, I'm really talking about the accent color. So mostly that's embodied in the team's stocking color. So you can see that Pittsburgh in 1887 wore red as an accent color. In 89, they switched to orange and black. And then the next year they went to black, all black. In 93, they went to red. 95, they went to blue. 97, they went to brown. And keep in mind that before 1900, there were no team logos or word marks, and every uniform design was very ubiquitous. Every uniform looked the same, the materials were the same. And as I said, therefore, the only real identifiable mark for a team was the color of their stockings. And speaking of stockings, clearly the most famous use of team color in the 19th century, maybe in the entire history of all sport, was the Cincinnati Red Stockings. As we know, they were a team of firsts, revolutionizing the game in countless ways, one of which was baseball fashion. In fact, the Red Stocking identity was so powerful, it actually usurped the team name in newspaper reports and in ads for upcoming games. In fact, if you make out the caption on this illustration, it says the pick 9 of the Red Stocking Baseball Club. It doesn't say the Cincinnati Baseball Club, it says the Red Stocking Baseball Club. And the Red Stocking identifier was so powerful that when Cincinnati returned to the professional ranks in 1876, the club then maintained red as a team color throughout the 19th century. As you can see, from 1876 all the way to 1900, they always wore red. So why did Cincinnati, quote unquote, get it and Pittsburgh didn't? Why did Cincinnati feel it necessary to continue the look established by Harry Wright even after Harry Wright had moved from Cincinnati to Boston and brought the red stocking identity with him? Why did Pittsburgh not feel the need to connect to a color like Cincinnati did? And which was the norm, Cincinnati or Pittsburgh? So in the early 1870s, the influence of the Red Stockings was far-reaching. In fact, immediately after, teams began to emulate the look, picking their own unique color. And here are some examples. You can see the White Stockings picked, the Chicago team picked white, so they were known as the White Stockings. The Olympics of Washington, D.C. were the Blue Stockings. The Mutuals of New York were the Green Stockings. The Eckfords of Brooklyn were the Yellow Stockings. Hartford was the Dark Blues, and St. Louis was the Brown Stockings. So by looking at this, if I were to ask my question, did the concept of team color exist in the 19th century? I would have to say from the period of the 1870s, the answer would be yes. Teams of this era thought it was important to be associated with a color, and this was especially true for Boston, which wore red stockings and won 4 out of the 5 National Association pennants. So let's look closer at the National Association in 1871. You can see that Boston had red, but the Kekiangas of Indiana also had red. Chicago wore white. The Haymakers of Troy, New York, wore brown. The Cleveland team wore dark blue, and so did the Olympic team of Washington, D.C. The athletic team wore light blue, and both the Mutuals and the Rockford team of Illinois were green. So an immediate observation is that it was impossible for a club to own a specific color. And this was because certain colors were simply not used. Yellow and pink weren't used because they were often led to ridicule. And purple was not used because it was deemed too expensive to produce. And the combination of green and orange was also not used because it had an association with England and Ireland, especially in the 1880s and the 1890s. And green, by the way, also had an association with blood poisoning, which cut down how many teams wanted to wear green. And black was not used because it was a mourning color. In fact, there was one newspaper report that said when the Washington club first put on black pants, quote, they were afraid to put them on and go to the game for the fear that people would think they were attending a funeral, end quote. So if we look at team color again today, we can see that many colors do in fact own a single color, in this case, red. So we have the Phillies in the top left, the Cardinals in the top right, the Nationals in the bottom left, and the Reds in the bottom right. And we know that in the 19th century, there were no marketing departments. It was basically the team manager who was the sole decision maker. And often he would work in conjunction with Albert Spalding, who in 1876 created his own sporting goods manufacturing entity. And here you see Albert with 2 ads, one for the league ball that he pushed, and also for the uniforms that he now offered. But sometimes Albert would go too far. And one idea to corner the uniform market was to create an arrangement with the National League to adopt a color coding system. Now, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this, but most in the 19th century committee are well versed in the craziness of 1882 when Spalding dressed each player of one team in a specific uniform dictated by their position on the field. So you can see the 1882 Chicago team here. The catcher wore a red shirt. The first baseman wore a red striped shirt. The second baseman wore a black and orange striped shirt, and so on. So that was the Chicago team. But all 8 teams in the NL wore the same uniform. So for example, if the Chicago first baseman came to bat wearing a red striped shirt and a red striped hat and got a base hit, he would now be standing on first base. And the defending team's first baseman would also be wearing a red striped shirt and a red striped cap. The only difference between those 2 teams were the color of the stockings. And the Spalding color coding system was described like this in the papers before the beginning of the 1882 season. The distinguishing difference between the players of different clubs will be in the color of their stockings alone, and each is to retain the hosiery, which has in some cases become its trademark. So even though the uniforms were crazy, we actually had color nirvana in regard to team color in 1892 because the color needed to represent a specific team. Each team had their own color. Boston was red, Cleveland was blue. Detroit was a color that was called Old Gold. Chicago was white, Buffalo was gray, Providence light blue, Troy and Worcester were green and brown. So this is where I asked the conference, how many people would think that color nirvana would last. And one of the reasons I asked that is because in 1883, both Troy and Worcester were replaced by New York and Philadelphia. So at the National League meeting before the 1883 season, it was determined that, quote, the New York and Philadelphia clubs were to select their own colors and that the colors would be distinctive and not in conflict with any of the other colors selected by the other clubs. Well, Nirvana didn't really last very long. When Philadelphia and New York were admitted in 1883, they chose colors that were right for them, not right for the league. New York chose red because everyone wanted to wear red. And Philadelphia chose red to differentiate from the Athletics, who traditionally wore light blue. In fact, in one game in 1883, when Boston and Philadelphia were playing each other, one newspaper said that, quote, the Philadelphia's new uniform resembles the Boston's very much. They both have white suits trimmed with red stockings, and they even had a white cap with a red visor. So again, you can see it was quite confusing at times on the field. Things got worse. If you were look at the year of 1885 in both the National League and the American Association, you'll see that of the major league teams, 11 out of the 16 wore red. And this fact was even more interesting considering the general opinion that maroon was a bad luck color. Despite this many teams wore red. And one of the realizations I had when I was doing this presentation was that because the stockings were so similar, you needed a way to differentiate the teams. And right about this time, in fact, the next year of 1886 is when the road uniform started to become an idea and was made official by 1890. So since everyone's wearing red on your legs, you needed to wear white or gray to define if you were the home team or the road team. So if I were to ask my question again about whether or not the concept of team color existed, I would say by the mid 1880s, the answer was certainly no, or that it was less important. And most of these decisions were made by the color decisions were made by the managers. And at this time, the team's identities were more based on the managers. It was the managers' personalities and the players' personalities that really embodied the identity of the team. It no longer was the color of the stockings. In a few years after this, though, a new color virtually obliterated the notion of team color. And that was brown, or black, sorry, that was black. In 1888, the black fad took over, and it started with the Chicago team first. In 1888, Chicago abandoned their white stockings, which they had worn since 1870, and wore black, which literally changed how the team was perceived. Here's a report from opening day. When the Chicago club marched at the opening game, they were not recognized. The suits materially altered the appearance of Anson and every man in uniform. So increasingly in the second half of the 19th century, black found its way into everyday fashion. And this kind of began with Queen Victoria, who mourned Prince Albert for over 40 years. And slowly, the idea of wearing black turned into an everyday color. Neutrals were big in the 1890s. White, beige, gray, and black were staples for most wardrobes. And as I said, usually the manager was responsible for choosing a team color. In this case, the choice went to Mrs. Anson. So when it came to describing how the color came about, the New York Clipper said that the designer of Chicago's black and gray is Mrs. Adrian C. Anson. She obtained the idea from the colors of the auditorium in which the Republican convention will be held in Chicago next month. In fact, Anson had so little to do with color when it came to one newspaper asking him about a club's uniform for the next year. He replied, quote, I leave that to Mrs. Anson. She settles all questions of that kind, unquote. In fact, in his autobiography in 1900, he makes no mention of the decision to abandon the white stocking look, for which the team had been famous and won many championships. So why did Chicago switch? Well, in 1887, Detroit won the National League pennant, not Chicago, and Detroit was wearing blue stockings and blue pants and white stockings. So it's possible that Anson and maybe Spalding felt that their color had been stolen. But when the 1888 season started, Chicago started out hot. They started the season with a 21-9 record. Most teams were very superstitious during this period, as they are now. So if you found success with the color, you went with it. So Chicago adopted black as the team color for the rest of the year, and they wore that for the next 6 seasons. The black fad reached its peak with this uniform, the New York All Black, first worn on July 28, 1888. In the week before, the Philadelphia Times mentioned that next week, New York will blaze forth in a uniform that James Mutry says will knock the town silly. It will consist of black jersey shirts and knee pants. This was during a period when both Chicago and New York were trying to upstage each other. And since Chicago had already come out with a black stocking uniform, New York took it one step further and went with all black. They also try to outdo each other by wearing fancy costumes and coats. One newspaper said that, quote, the Chicagos marched from the clubhouse in their full dress coats. Then came the Giants wearing linen dusters and high white hats in a burlesque of the Chicago costumes, end quote. And much like the Chicago uniform, the all-black uniform of New York was inspired by an unlikely source, the New York theater. A lot of the baseball players went to the theater as a group during this time period, and they were influenced by this one performance. So this is a picture of Marie Jensen, and they modeled their uniform after the costumes worn by her in the operetta Nadji, then playing at the casino. So the New York uniform was a tight-fitting black uniform, and soon many teams were sporting the quote-unquote black Nadji style. And because New York won the pennant in 1888 and 1889, much like the Cincinnati Red Stockings of 1869, a winning team defined a fashion, so black soon became very popular. Once again, the league tried to take control. At the national meeting before 1890, it was reported that each club would be required to wear a distinctive colored uniform for the 1890 season. And NL executive Nick Young was charged with selecting the colors for each club. And here again is where I would ask the conference if we think Nick was successful or not successful. And the answer was he was not successful. As you can see, the league failed, and they had little to say over what the teams wore. In fact, in 1890, if you look at these NL stocking colors, there isn't a pair of blue stockings anywhere. So if I were to ask the question again, did the concept of team color exist in the 19th century? I would say in the period of 1890s, circa 1890, I would say the answer is no. The black fad had pretty much wiped out any lingering notion of team color. As a study, a part of the study for this presentation, I created team color report cards to better understand the color choices of each team. And I'm going to end this presentation now by showing 3 of those report cards. Here's the Boston card. So the solid circle is what the accent color they wore at home. The open circle is the accent color they wore on the road. You can see they wore pretty much all the time at home, they wore red. But in the 1890s, you'll see they started to wear blue. And here are some of the uniforms that Frank Seeley, the Boston manager, selected for the Boston team. A lot of these were for the road use, but some were for home. In fact, the one on the far left from June of 1892 was described as peacock light blue. And the Boston Globe reported, quote, the home team does not look natural in blue stockings. Please give us red, end quote. If we look at Pittsburgh, you can see that they changed color 7 times. 5 of the 7 changes came with a new manager. 3 of the 7 changes came after a losing season. And if you look at all the report cards, which I'm not going to show you, for all of the NL teams between 1876 and 1900, I can come up with a general number to say that 37% of the time, the color was changed with the arrival of a new manager. And 43% of the time, the color was changed after a losing season. Other reasons why color change was basically at the whim of the manager or his wife. And sometimes it was for luck. So if I were to ask the question one more time, did the concept of team color exist? I'd say the answer is yes and no. It existed in the 1867 to circa 1882 period. And then after that, it slowly faded away so that the idea of team color didn't really exist. One last report card to look at, and this is the St. Louis franchise. Of course, they were the Browns in the American Association for many years, and their team color and nickname was tied to the color of their stockings, which they first wore in 1875. And you can see they pretty much wore brown all through their history until the very end in 1899. So much like Chicago and Boston, Chicago abandoned the white stocking look for black. Boston abandoned the red stocking look for blue, more or less. St. Louis abandoned the brown color for red. And the reason was, again, luck. When St. Louis started in 1876, they wore brown. They had a good winning percentage of .589. When they went to the American Association in 1882, they won 4 championships during that period, and their winning percentage was .644. By the time they moved to the National League in 1892, when the leagues contracted, they did poorly and only had a .326 winning percentage. So when the owners decided to merge Cleveland with St. Louis in 1898, in 1899, they decided to choose a new team color. And the St. Louis newspaper said, quote, "Brown stockings so long identified with the St. Louis club will not be in evidence this season. The home suits of the club will be of white flannel with crimson trimmings. Thus, it will be hardly possible to call them the Browns. In fact, by the 1900 season, they were known as the Cardinals." And much like the original Cincinnati team, the Cardinal nickname came from the color of the stockings. And in some ways, it revived the idea of a color-based identity heading into the new century. That's it. Thank you for your time, folks. I appreciate it.
There are some great questions in the chat that I've been trying to go back to, but if you put a question in the chat, would you please go down to the reaction button, go down to the bottom of the screen and hit reaction, and then hit raise hand. Raise your hand and get in line to ask questions of our presenter tonight. Craig Brown will be happy to answer some of your questions. There were some great comments in here, and there were some great questions. There was some talk of the City Connect uniforms as well. So I want to get to those. But first up is our friend from Toronto, Gabriel Lerman. Gabe, how are you?
Doing well, thanks. Although I think Gary beat me to the punch, but I'll take the spot
You know,
anyway.
it doesn't order it correctly anymore. Computers, they're not supposed to make sense. Go.
Okay, my question, Craig, is around if commodity prices have played a role. Like if blue dye all of a sudden became too expensive, they changed the color to brown. Did that have any effect on the whim, or was it all around? Because you mentioned purple would be too expensive.
Yeah, purple is too expensive, and you could probably guess that red was maybe the more affordable color. Maybe that's why Cincinnati picked it to begin with. So yeah, I think that probably had something to do with it.
Thank you.
All right, next up is Gary Joquin. Gary, how you doing?
Oh, pretty good, pretty good. Hey, I've trained for quite a few marathons, and avoiding blisters and chafing was such a big deal. To do that, I relied on high-tech materials and just all kinds of Vaseline-like running products that reduced friction. So I'm just curious, what accommodations did players in the 19th century make? What were the uniforms made of?
Well, the uniforms were heavy flannel for the most part, although those Nagy uniforms were a knit material, which was it was tighter fitting and closer to the body and probably a tighter weave and not made so much of wool, I guess. But yeah, flannel, heavy flannel is what most players wore. And under their stockings, sometimes they would wear a silk stocking under their regular stockings. And that was to give them another layer of protection, because they were afraid, and there are reports that when a player got spiked, that they would get infected by the dye of the stockings. Whether or not green was really the cause of that, maybe more, fairy tale than anything else. But I'm trying to think of another example. But yeah, but so yes, but to answer your question, wool was it. And you'll see in the 1880s and 1890s that players are starting to wear undershirts with their uniforms, and you'll see that a lot of players are literally cutting off their sleeves because the sleeves are just too heavy. And you'll find pictures of pitchers where their pitching arm is cut, the uniform sleeve is cut way short on their pitching arm, so that it could more easily pitch to the batter.
Thank you.
I'm just sitting here thinking about wearing a black flannel uniform
in the summer
in July.
Yeah.
With
Well, that's not just, Bruce, that's just not 19th century. That's true in the 20th century, all the way up until the double knit era of the 1970s. So I think Spalding did come up with a lighter flannel material somewhere after World War II, but most of the 20th century was still the same heavy flannel.
God, can you imagine those all black uniforms? I'm hot just thinking about it. Steve Klugman has a comment or a question. Steve, unmute and go get him, my friend. How are you this evening? You gotta hit unmute. There you go.
Yeah, I don't know most of you. I'm a visitor from the small town in New York City. But good to be on the line with you. Can I ask a different question that I think might be more interesting than the City Connects one? Well, I'll just go ahead and
go for it.
I grew up in Philadelphia, and the Eagles were green, and I spent portions of my summers in Kansas City when Charlie Finley switched from blue to green. And I assume, although I can't say I recall, that that's what got me curious about the fact why there was at that time no green in any major league uniform. And years later, when I got the uniform book, I saw that green had been used a couple of times. I think the Dodgers one year.
Right.
And that's kind of sat in the back of my mind. I was always curious about it, never got it. And I was looking at something else a couple of years ago, and I don't know whether you know about this, Craig, about how it is that Dartmouth adopted green.
Yes.
Let me tell the story real quickly. And there are several versions. I don't know if it matters which one is true, but then I have a question about it. In 1866, I believe it was. And by the way, on the cost thing, one of the reasons Harvard changed from magenta, which was their original color, to crimson was that magenta cloth was either too expensive or hard to find. I'm not sure which. That was in the context of crew. But in any event, they had a meeting in Dartmouth. So what are we going to do? All the good colors are taken. And I think by good, they meant primary, even though green's not a primary color. And somebody suggested green. There was opposition for two reasons. One is they'll think we're all Fenians. And somebody says, well, if we adopt green, our school song is going to have to be the wearing of the green. And also it was said that green connoted rawness, inexperience, maybe even incompetence. And I wonder, is that the reason why? Obviously there were concerns at various points in early baseball about being too Irish in terms of the players. Do those things have anything to do why?
I would say that was definitely it. That was definitely it. Both green and orange. There are reports where I think it was Pud Galvin who, when he went to Pittsburgh, they had orange stockings one year, and he refused to wear orange because that meant Northern Ireland to him.
Right.
So and vice versa. I think there are players that didn't want to wear green. So I think those two colors were pretty much for the most part out. I mean, there are examples of teams wearing green. I did a post on my website about the Buffalo team of the International League wearing all green in the 1890s. That was a John Chapman choice. And you had fans coming to the game down from Canada down to Buffalo and booing the players because they didn't like the green. Anyways, interesting that you mentioned Dartmouth, and that was actually part of my presentation, but it was too long for the Fred, so I cut it out. But the origin of team color really started with college crew, and that was really the first sport where you would see, and Harvard was the leader there, where you'd see a team wearing a color, and usually it was just like in a handkerchief they had in their pocket or something. And then slowly,
and I said the reason was so you can see which team was which, because they might be far away.
Yeah, exactly. And that sort of introduced the idea of team color. I also did an exploration on how much team color in cricket transferred over to baseball. And there wasn't a lot of team color in cricket. A lot of teams wore white. And I mean, there was some examples of teams being, off the grid kind of thing, wearing polka dots and stripes and everything. And there were a few cricket teams in England that I think were known for their colors, but generally speaking, the notion of color didn't come from cricket; it came from crew.
Great, thank you.
We talk about green, and it takes me back to my very first big boy job years ago when I was working for the dearly departed National Hockey League Hartford Whalers, and we had some green.
Yeah, that was green, right?
Yeah, you bet it was. Yep, they added a little blue. Gabe Lerman in the chat. Brass Bonanza intensifies. Brass Bonanza is always intense, always. Let's go back to Gary Joklin, who's got another comment. Gary, go.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. It's fun how orange and green come up because they're such unusually dominant colors in Oregon, where OSU orange and the Green Ducks face off frequently in heavyweight matches that are billed as civil wars. After living in Northern Virginia, where civil wars actually meant civil wars, this was just kind of fun. I was just wondering, has anyone done any work to trace over time the climate in the late 19th century through to the 20th century to see if the average temperatures of games changed, and to alleviate heat, to even have more comfortable fan bases. What time did games take place? In the morning, late afternoon? Did they try intentionally to avoid the hottest part of the day, or were they driven?
They really wanted to, obviously baseball was a business, so you're trying to play your games when the most fans can take the train and go to see the game. So most times games were in the afternoon, middle of the afternoon. A lot of times games would end early because they'd run out of daylight, or because the team had to jump on the train to go to the next city to play their game. If it was a doubleheader, you would find a morning game. So that would, to your point, that would have probably been an easier game to play. But no, they played 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right at the hottest time. And there was no, as far as I know, there really wasn't any difference for Southern teams. Like I said, you'll find teams cutting off their sleeves, but everyone wore the same heavy uniforms, even in the South.
Bruce Allardyce. Bruce, could you unmute for just a moment, please? I hope you don't mind me putting you on the spot here, my friend. You had a couple of good comments in the chat. I was hoping you could get on camera. Do you mind?
No, not at all. The first comment I had was, just from the study of military history, red was always the cheapest color for dyes. And that's why the British Army, among other things, which is a very long story, adopted red as their uniform.
That makes sense.
Just to differentiate, most of the other armies did blue just because they didn't want to show that they didn't want to be British, basically. But But I also did a study, we got Protoball, we got 14,000 clubs prior to 1871 in the database, and I took a look at what were the club nicknames. And about 7% had color nicknames prior to 1871. And of those, it was red as the most common nickname of a club, followed by black, actually. And then white, blue, green, silver, and brown.
Very interesting.
The major leagues obviously were much higher percentage of teams actually had a color connection than the teams before them, which is understandable because they were big city. They were already identified by a big city. But just wanted to throw that out. That this is sort of an odd statistical thing that sort of backs up your point.
Interesting. Great. Thanks, Bruce.
Mark Hoyle in the chat says, my first Little League uniforms in 70-71 were flannel. And my comment was, oh my gosh, can you imagine? Whoa, little kids out there in the flannel. Woo. Hey, Mark, was that like oppressive or can you unmute? Where are you, man? I think I lost him. All right.
We had flannel Little League uniforms in North Carolina.
Oh my goodness. Holy moly.
Can I say something about dyes?
Sure.
This may be wrong, and I don't know, maybe it's hard for me to judge the ages of people looking at them, but I grew up doing sports in the 60s mostly, and it was drilled into us, never, ever, 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 ever wear any color socks but white. Because if you do, you'll get the dyes and you'll probably die. So you will never see a photo of an athlete up to, I would guess, mid-70s. That's just a guess. Not wearing white socks underneath. I've always understood that's where the stirrups came from, that guys had to wear white socks for health reasons, real or fanciful. Well, and they wanted to have colored socks, so they needed to cut out the stirrup.
That's correct. In fact, right after 1900 is when you'll see I found one picture of a player wearing cutout stirrups in the Western League. I can't remember the year offhand. I want to say it was somewhere in the late 1890s. But a lot of the teams were wearing white under their colored stockings for protection, and then eventually it was, too difficult to have a double sock in your shoe, basically. So that's how the stirrup kind of evolved, and slowly got skinnier and skinnier.
They made socks when I was a kid with white feet portions and then colored.
That's right.
Uppers.
Yeah. You would see that a lot.
I don't think they caught on for whatever reason.
No.
Thanks.
Well, actually, even in the 1980s, I know sometimes you wore white socks that had an imprinted stirrup on it. It was actually
I remember this.
It was part of the white stocking, of the white sock.
Joanne in the chat, sanitary socks. That's what they were called because of the danger of infection from dyes, apparently. So
that's correct.
There you go. Tell us a little bit about the website, would you please, Craig?
Yeah, so it's threadsofourgame.com. And it's been up for about 12 years. And I encourage everyone, if you're doing your own research in the 19th century and you come across anything that's uniform related, please use the website and reach out to me and send it to me. Or if you find something at an auction site you think is an interesting visual that maybe no one has seen before, please email it to Threads and we'll add it to the database. It really is a community, SABR community database that everyone can contribute to. And I definitely encourage as many people as possible to visit and send me stuff.
So have a look at that. Let's go to Andy Hickroth before we go tonight.
Right. Can you hear me? Okay. Greg, I had an interesting question because I'm a Cardinals fan. I've heard a story that the Cardinals got their name because somebody, whether it was a fan or somebody with an ownership, looked at the Cardinals Red Stockings and said, "Oh, what a beautiful shade of Cardinal." Have you heard in your research? Did you ever find something?
That story is one of the famous stories. I don't know. I haven't done the research to find it, but I believe other researchers have that. That might be more myth than reality. I think it was. There's so much misinformation. In fact, one of the little pleasures I get out of this project is debunking things that have been passed down from generation to generation.
Sure.
That everyone takes as fact, but if you follow that information trail back to the original source, you either find it's true or you'll find that there's no mention of it, and it got fabricated sometime later, and then every other historian and writer had picked it up and carried that story on. I'm a little fuzzy on whether or not that one's been debunked or not, but I definitely know it. It's a very famous story. And there were other examples before that of a team calling their Red Stockings a cardinal color. But it was just happened at that moment. The St. Louis team introduced red, and it was 1900, the second year they wore red. And you know, everyone needs a nickname, so they latched onto that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Back to Gary Joquin for one more. Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, Bruce gave me permission to ask a dad question. Craig, forgive me, but how did you get interested in this thread?
Well, I'm a graphic designer and a marketing person, so I really, I've been sort of following the visual history of baseball my whole life. I've been interested in it since I was a kid. In fact, I remember I was probably about 8 years old, and I took a white T-shirt and drew my own Orioles. I was an Oriole fan back then. Drew my own Orioles T-shirt, made my own, proto jersey, if you will. So I just like the graphic appeal of it, and I love the 19th century because it's such a mysterious time period, and there's the photos the photos that you find hold so much like enchantment, and you see these young kids, that lived over 130 years ago. It's a fascinating combination of graphics and sports and baseball.
That's very cool. I was so enamored with graphic design that I married one, and my wife and I have been stuck together for 43 years.
It's fantastic. This has been good stuff. This has been great stuff, Greg.
Thank you. Appreciate it all, guys.
Appreciate you coming down. Now, join us next week, Monday, September 29th, when we have SABR member and good friend of our chapter, Herb Krabenhoff, with us. I have to be careful with his last name because I butcher it every time I say it. His presentation is entitled Tim Keefe's 1880 ERA, a still standing single season ML pitching record, yes or no? I've seen this presentation. It's very interesting. The sign up link is available in the chapter meeting booklet and at the SABR events calendar. And finally, if you're a baseball fan watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please like this video and subscribe to our channel to be alerted to each of our weekly uploads. And finally, if you are not yet a member, you need to join the Society for American Baseball Research, the premier baseball community. Offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom, SABR boasts more than 35 different research committees, over 80 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world, just like Craig. For more information, go to SABR.org today. Craig Brown. Awesome stuff, my guy. Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Let's get everybody out of here so they can watch a little baseball before we go to the playoffs. Let's go. We'll see you next week, everybody. Thanks for coming out.